The federal deficit is on track to exceed $1 trillion next year and grow even more after that. The deficit is the difference between the amount the government takes in, often through taxes, and what it spends. Last week, the Congressional Budget Office released its forecast for 2020. The updated projections show a large increase from data gathered earlier this year. In May, the office predicted the deficit would reach $892 billion next year. The estimates also now show deficits rising through 2023. That's the year the number is expected to reach its highest peak since World War II. Maya MacGuineas is president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. She joins me now from our Washington bureau. Maya, thanks so much for joining us. What has contributed to these updated projections showing an increase in the deficit?
Right. So the numbers are certainly kind of jaw-dropping in how large they are, but they're not entirely surprising because the big jump up in the budget deficit and the ongoing growth is the result of major policy legislation that Congress has passed and the president has signed into law in the past few years, starting with the huge unpaid-for tax cut that added trillions of dollars to the national debt. Talk at the time was, oh, the tax cut will pay for itself, but that's clearly wasn't going to happen and hasn't happened. And then that was quickly followed by not one but two massive spending bill increases that also were not offset. So we're now in a moment where policymakers barely think about paying for legislation, and the result is a huge ballooning budget deficit.
Some people might think about this in terms of just domestic politics, but the U.S. is currently locked in a trade war with China. Both countries' economies are closely tied. How much does the U.S. owe to China when we talk about American debt? And is that debt a potential weakness for the U.S.?
Yeah, I can't stress enough that while that's not the kind of ground that this trade war is being fought on right now, it certainly is a tool in the toolbox, and it's a situation where China has a big advantage over the U.S. in that they currently own about $1 trillion of the U.S. national debt. We borrow about 40% of our money when we run a budget deficit from overseas, and Japan and China are our two largest creditors. So certainly they have the ability to pull back on how much they're lending to the U.S. or flood the market with treasuries. That would hurt China and their economy, but it would also hurt the U.S. So it really depends on how big the stakes here become. But we are playing on a very dangerous playing field because of our dependency on borrowing.
So with this dependency, are there implications for American national security potentially?
There certainly are. So we have gotten to the point where our economic and our national security are very highly interrelated in that one of our biggest foreign policy and national security weaknesses is our high level of indebtedness. You have many national security experts saying that. And we cannot call the shots, build our own strategies, have our own objectives, and pursue those goals against countries that we are also simultaneously economically dependent on. And so I think that one of the ways to think about the fiscal situation and the implications of it is that we are creating vulnerabilities that are unnecessary at a time when tensions are kind of roiling with us and other countries around the world. You would rather have us be a lot more independent and fiscally healthy.
You don't necessarily hear these days people from either party really talking about this issue, but can you put this into perspective for us? What are the immediate and long-term consequences of deficits reaching these kinds of levels for Americans? And what, for instance, could these deficit levels mean if the nation were to fall into a recession?
That's right, and that's the key issue there. And you don't hear politicians talking about it right now because the truth is, if you're a politician, it's much more fun to spend a lot of money or cut a lot of taxes and not worry about how you're going to pay for it. So instead, what you hear is kind of false claims and free lunch promises all over the place about how things will pay for themselves or they're so important we shouldn't pay for them. And none of that is sound budgeting, because having a high debt like we do both can slow the growth of the economy when the debt becomes too high. It can lead to interest payments that are growing faster than other parts of the budget and squeezing them out. And as you referenced, it means that if and when a recession hits, and there are plenty of signs that that could happen sooner rather than later, we have really depleted one of the two important toolboxes for fighting that recession. So while monetary policy is somewhat constrained because interest rates are already so low, fiscal policy is also going to have its own challenges because our debt relative to our economy right now is twice as high as it was when we went into the last recession of 2008. That means fiscal policy responses to help get us out of the recession will be a lot more challenging.
Why do you think it is at this point? You touched on it a moment ago, but why do you think it is that really folks from either party are really not sort of focused on this issue, say, compared to just a few years ago where you might have had some people raising these questions about fiscal responsibility?
Absolutely, because this is a political problem right now more than it is a policy challenge. We know how to fix the fiscal situation if we are willing to make those choices. It's going to take more revenues and controlling our spending. But I think what we're seeing is that the debt is now really a symptom of kind of the hyper-partisan and broken political environment where the two parties are really not willing to do any of the things you need to do to fix the debt. They're not willing to focus on good policy rather than politics. They're not willing to focus on long-term sustainability rather than short-term boosts. They're not willing to compromise. They're not willing to make hard choices. And so as a result, I think we are looking at kind of a partisan civil war that is keeping us from really addressing big policy challenges where we need to make hard choices, we need to compromise, and we need to look at the sustainable situation in the U.S. And I worry that down the road, we're going to be paying a very significant price for having punted on all these choices.
And if you could just bottom line it for us, Maya, given the political landscape that you just outlined, what do you see as the trajectory here for U.S. debt levels and therefore the effect on Americans who, may be looking to do everything from borrow money for student loans or rely on the government in some way, shape, or form in the future for help with their own financial situations?
Yeah, it's going to take strong leadership. Hopefully it won't be a crisis of sorts, but to get us out of this situation. And until we are there, it means that people who depend on government programs are increasingly vulnerable to those changes, that the economy will be more constrained than it otherwise would be. And that's at a time when we already have an aging population. And I think most importantly, there are going to be big new needs in our economy based on the future of work, changing technology, ongoing issues in globalization. And our government is not in a position to help and serve as a partner in figuring out how to address those challenges when we're so indebted. And I think that as with the pace of change continues to grow, these challenges will become more and more difficult, and the government needs to get in control of its finances as quickly as possible so it can address those to help American people.
All right, Maya MacGuineas in Washington for us. Maya, thank you very much for your perspective.
Thank you.